but most of them were pretty tiny, less than a couple thousand people each. This one had, they say, about 35,000 people in it. So this is the region that becomes the heartland of the Tarascan whole empire. And everything that happened in the empire was ruled from that city, Tinsunsan. This is the wider area that they ultimately dominated. Here's Tinsunsan here for reference. And it went all through the mountains, and it hit the coast here, and really over here as well. This one's a little off and a little pixelated. But so this wider empire was acquired much like the Aztecs did. Every year they had these almost ritualistic moments where every male in society was required to be part of an expansionary force. And every year they'd take over more and more of the little towns of this region until it all became one empire. And every one of those places had to give tribute to Tinsunsan, which made them more and more powerful. But the question is, who are all these people over here that they dominated? Archaeology and contact sees them as part of the Tarascan state or empire. And they were definitely acculturated as part of that when the Spanish arrived. But who were they before that? That might just answer why they're speaking a different language. Well, we know that long before the Tarascans showed up, remember I said it was about 1250, about 300 to 700 AD, we have this amazing culture all around West Mexico. We used to just call them the West Mexico culture. But nowadays we're calling them the Tuchitlan culture. And they made these very interesting, unique centers that had circular buildings, and they had these circular plazas with the rectangular buildings around them. These big poles. Has anybody ever been to like Tulum and seen those guys that fly off the poles? They attach a rope. Well, actually, that tradition came from over here in West Mexico. It made it all around Mexico, but its first appearances are on the top of these big things that were in the middle of Tuchitlan cities. These things also had BC period beginnings. So there was a culture there that grew up into this very sophisticated culture on the West Coast. And it was long, long before the Tarascans. This is a rough map of where that Tuchitlan culture region happened. So all in here. We've got Tinsunsan down here. So it's outside of this area. It's a little north. This is where most of the big cities were, but they're all lined up along the rivers here. And this whole area was dominated by this culture for hundreds of years. This is a picture of what one of those sites, Guachimontones, looks like today. You can see that circular terraces and the things going around it. This is a nice little model of what it might have looked like in its heyday. So very unique looking places and big, sophisticated, and very different from everywhere else. Now underneath these buildings, and also in various places and villages, they had a very unique burial pattern too. If this is that center circular one and these are the rectangular ones going around it, oftentimes each one of these rectangular ones had these shaft tombs underneath them. They'd go down 5, 6, sometimes even 10 meters into the earth, and then they'd open up into these big crypts. And inside those crypts were just incredible amounts of burial offerings, just absolutely full of bodies, but also lots and lots of goods that went along with them. Unfortunately, people figured out that those were there, and they dug all of these. There's been maybe 2 found by archaeologists before looters. The rest of them, looters got to them. And this beautiful art from inside these spread all over the illegal artifacts market. And then finally, people figured out where they were from. Actually, it was the artist Diego Rivera who really blew the whistle on it because he loved the art. This is one little example. I didn't want to spend too much time on these background guys, but they made these amazing figurines. Oftentimes they were in pairs. They showed people in really like real life, everyday contexts. They were having fun, they were playing music instruments, they were eating. They also made these amazing little models. See how this little house looks just like the one in the reconstruction drawing? Here, I'll slip back real quick. These little houses here with these kind of pitched roofs. Like, how do we know that from this little platform here? Well, we know that because they conveniently made us these cool little models of what their houses look like. They also showed us ball courts and people watching ball games. Fantastic stuff has been found in these tombs, and they were a unique and really artistic culture. One of my very favorite things from their art are these guys, the Colima dogs. There's hundreds of them looted out of these tombs. Everybody apparently had these little pot-bellied dogs, and they always showed them in silly little poses like this, playing together, just standing around being fat or stealing someone's corn. Just neat stuff. There's one that I can never find the image to, but there's one where they're like a little cheerleading troupe. There's 3 on the bottom and then 2 and then 1 on top. But they're all made out of ceramic. Anybody who's ever tried to make a ceramic, that's hard to make. These guys are experts. So they made this incredible art tradition, but they also found in quantity in these graves something very important. We found metal. And everywhere else in Mexico at this time, nobody knew how to make metal. The Maya never did it. In all of those beautiful Maya sites with all those pyramids, there's not a speck of metal there. If it is, it's because people from the West Coast or the Mixtec sent it to them. So they were making pretty elaborate objects in this culture, made of gold and silver, but mostly copper, arsenical copper. And this is the very, very first metallurgy in Mexico. But where did it come from? Well, we're fairly certain that they learned it from South American traders. At the same time that the Tenochtitlan culture is going on, down in Peru, they're master metal makers. The culture called Moche are making these incredible things. And so we think that the knowledge of how to make metal and metallurgy came from traders that came up in boats and connected on the west coast of Mexico to these Tenochtitlan people. One real strong indicator of that, too, is not just the technology, but the things they made. You see these 2 things that are very specific forms? These are things called tumi knives, and they're all over South America. But what are they doing up here? It's what archaeology calls a diagnostic artifact, when it's got such a particular shape that you know it had to come from somewhere else. Here's one brief but illuminating example of where these tumi knives come from. Here's one being held in this figure's hand. He's got little heads around his. This is a god that I'll tell you a lot more about if you come to my 4 o'clock talk. In this kind of pose, they call him the Decapitator Deity. I call him the Fang Deity, and I see him in a lot of different contexts. But every time we see him in this pose, he's got somebody's severed head, and he's saying, I did it with this tumi knife. And this particular form shows up in West Mexico. It's almost the smoking gun, though frustratingly, we've never found any South American outposts there, nor have we found any Mexican outposts down in Peru. There have been entire conferences trying to prove the connection, but we still have these sort of things that are, you know, from the archaeology side of me, I call this art history, and I thumb my nose at it. It's art history. You don't have any real artifacts, you've just got art history. But I think there's a real strong connection, especially looking at that shape versus, I'll go back, that shape. I mean, that's a weird shape. You don't just come up with that. And the fact that it's metallurgy and they're making South America's favorite object, I think there's good reason to believe there was at least casual contact. And really, you know, you don't need to send a whole city over to teach people how to make metal. You say, well, you know, we find it in the riverbeds. Oh, look, you've got copper too. Here's what you do with it. It could have been a single ship coming and teaching them this technology that changed things. But in any event, the Tenochtitlan culture collapses about 700 or 800 AD. All of these cities that were making these shaft tombs and these beautiful buildings, they fade away. They just abandon those cities. And they do that along with the rest of Mesoamerica. During this period, 700 to 800, maybe 900 or some hangers-on, the entire world of Mesoamerica turns upside down. That's when the famous Maya mysterious collapse happens. They abandon all their cities. There's a big, huge city called Teotihuacan near Mexico City. They're abandoned at that time, and whatever happened turned the entire world for them on its head, and Teotihuacan went along with it. About 800 AD, none of those cities I was talking about are there anymore, but the people are still there. They moved to different places, and they stopped building those circular buildings. Instead, they're just building little rectangular buildings, and there's no more big cities. There are always just these little villages all over the place. And it's those villages that, centuries later, become incorporated into what becomes the Tarascan Empire. So we have that as the people that, if we take the Tarascans at their word and say, well, they were northern people that came down and blended with the population, it makes sense that those people that lived there for centuries before are the people they blended with. So I think we still see indicators that the Tarascans have this South American influence. And three reasons why. One, the metallurgy. It started in Western Mexico. It pretty much stayed in Western Mexico. And the Tarascans were real experts. Whatever started there, they brought it to a whole new level, making beautiful jewelry and other things. And we know that it came from South America. It's fairly well agreed that that's what happened. The second is the Tarascans were making this very particular kind of pottery form called stirrup vessels. And it's an odd form. I'll talk about that more in my next lecture too. But it's definitely from South America. And third, and most basically, the Purépecha language. For goodness sake, they're speaking a South American language. They were connected in some way, though archaeology's still trying to really piece together how. Just for your info, here is a Peruvian stirrup vessel. You can see why we call it a stirrup now. It looks like, you know, where you stick your foot in a saddle. And here's a Tarascan one. It's not exactly the same form, but boy, you know, that's weird. With the top, this opens up right there, and that opens up right there. There's a connection. You can almost see the kind of burnishing as well. There's a connection between these cultures. One other thing that makes me think that this contact with South America has been overlooked, and I think we can still find it actually, I think we're kind of looking in the wrong place, was this little spot right here. This is the Balsas River that comes pretty deep into Mexico. But when Cortez and his people took over the Aztecs, and then, you know, the Aztecs here, and then Tzintzuntzan, when they told Tzintzuntzan that they wanted more gold out of their mines, they sent them down this way, and Cortez's scouts said that they encountered people in big, huge dugout canoes that were coming up the coast and coming pretty far into the Balsa River, and that they'd stay there and trade, and that they were definitely from far away, and they'd stay there for 5 or 6 months, and then they'd take off, and they'd go back out into the ocean and away. Couple that with the fact that a few years later, maybe really only like 15 years later, when Pedro Alvarado was all the way down here in Guatemala, which I guess would be about here, he heard about all the crazy things that Pizarro was doing down in South America, and told his people in Guatemala, I need to get down there. And the local people already had established boat routes, and they brought him right to Ecuador. So there was a lot of boating that was going on here before we disrupted all of Mesoamerica. And I think that this spot here especially was a place where South America and Mexico were connecting. The trade winds are very favorable, by the way. It's kind of hard to make it back down, but you can be brought right up this coast fairly easily. So, you know, for this little section's conclusion, I think that the Tarascan origins were that there were local cultures with a lot of South American influence on the West Coast. And then these immigrants arrived from the north with more aggressive and new ways of doing things, and they changed the nature of society. And once that kind of new form, half the local people and half what they call the Chichimecas, came down. Those two together conspired to make this empire that became the Tarascan Empire, and they got rich by taxation and tribute payments from the rest of the region. Maybe they were emulating the Aztecs. Heck, maybe the Aztecs were emulating them, but it was the same kind of pattern that was going on right before contact. All right, well, let's talk about Tarascan society a little bit. Now that we've gotten through where their origins are, how they showed up there, let's talk a little bit about who they are. The truth is, we don't know a whole lot because the Spanish did a good job of annihilating a lot of things, diseases, annihilated a lot of people, so we oftentimes rely on the chronicles of the first contact, and that's the case here. We have one really good document called the Relación de Michoacán, and it was written by a priest, Geronimo de Alcana, in the 1530s. The Spanish got there right about 1521, so this is like a decade later. But his book is in three parts. It explains the Tarascans based on society, religion, and their history. A lot of what I just told you about their history comes out of the relation. And one smart thing he did, probably learning from Sahagún over in the Aztec area, is he really relied on old people. He asked old people how it used to be. He didn't just go around and see what people were doing today. He asked people how it used to be, and he also did what Sahagún pioneered, is that he'd never put anything in his book that he couldn't independently verify through three different people. So, a fairly good resource to work on, though, through the eyes of a foreigner. So, he told us that the entire empire was ruled from this palace at Tinsunsan, and it still stands. Here's an aerial view of at least the front temples in Tinsunsan. Actually, the palace was way back here, and the Spanish did a great job of annihilating it, and we still haven't really excavated what might still be there. But these were the temples that stood in front of it. And there was an emperor who lived there, and his title was Cazonce in their language. That's what they called him, the Cazonce. And everything in the kingdom was his property. A little unlike the Aztecs, because the Aztecs had people at personal ownership. In Tarascan society, conceptually at least, everything, and really everyone, was in the service of or owned by the Cazonce. And as I said, this capital city had a population of about 35,000 people in it. And then around the lake, this is an old drawing from the Spanish, showing there were some communities on islands in the lake. There's another little one here, and they numbered them all out. In total, they say there were about 90 different little communities all around the lake. And as I said, Turicuri and his nephews slowly absorbed all of these into agreeing that they were all one big community with Tinsunsan as the capital. And that lake and this valley was the core of the empire. And these guys eventually became kind of all one community, and they felt like, well, we're the real empire, and everybody else that we conquered, they can be part of our empire, but they're kind of second-class citizens. So there was kind of an attitude in the Tarascans that if you were from Pascaro, you were really Tarascan. And if you weren't, oh, poor I pet you, they'd say. And if not, you were kind of, a second-class citizen. So the rest of the area was like that. The people were mostly fishermen because of the lake. It was not only a way of living, but it was a pastime, it was an art. I put these two pictures together because it's neat how this is one painted in the colonial period with this kind of odd-looking net that they're using. But it's not that different from these ones that are people today. They look to be using the same kind of netting technology. This is a pretty cruddy drawing of that, but I can see where the two are together. So there's a lot of fishing. It's the primary occupation. But around the lake, there's also farming, and there were artisans. Another big thing for them was weaving. They were some of the best weavers in all of Mexico. That was one of their trade items all around their empire and outside of it. Their weaving was very superior. Here's actually a little Diego Rivera mural. This is part of the murals in the palace in Mexico City now. This was his depiction of of Tarascan society, and you can see all these weaved objects that they're dyeing, and this is a typical market. And most of these towns had a little market. The kind of heart of everyday life was the market. People would trade their wares there. They owed things to the king as well, but they were allowed to have their everyday life. And in these towns, they'd meet, they'd do things. It was very orderly, just like we have much better records about the Aztec market, which was 60,000 people, which was, the Spanish thought that market was bigger than anything they had ever seen in their life. Very orderly, there are policemen walking around, everything's in its nice little sectors. An interesting thing about the Tarascans, they say that only women ran the market stuff. The men were not allowed to do the economic business of running the market. They could be making stuff, but when it came to the business of selling it, it was the women's business, all in organized baskets. And just like you'd imagine when you go to like the farmer's market today, yeah, everybody's selling things, but they're also doing weird things. Like in these markets, you could go to restaurants and they'd be, you know, some of them would be Tarascan food. Maybe some of them would be like, you know, here's a Maya restaurant, just like, you know, the Chinese restaurant around the corner now. They'd have varying food and rare foods. They'd also have strange services, like you could get your hair cut in the market, or you could get your fortune told. A lively place, the center of society for an average village. Now, everybody, all those little villages in the town, around the lake, and the entire empire, owed tribute and taxes. And that had to go directly to Tinsunsan. And they had huge stores to collect all of this. Every person, every town owed a certain amount of tribute, and every person in that town was expected to contribute. And it was however the people of Tinsunsan said they were going to do it. Sometimes it was things, you know, sometimes it would be corn that you grew, or something you weaved, or sometimes it would be labor. A lot of the men got put into labor and sent away from their communities for as long as the emperor said they had to do it, and then they could go back. That system was organized by a group called the Pochtecas. They were merchants, but they were also kind of royal accountants. They were the traders, and they'd go around and they'd collect everything. They'd make sure town X has exactly as many rubber patties as they were told to give, and town Y has this many huipiles that they were going to give. The same sort of thing existed in the Aztec world, but the Pochteca there, they got really rich because the king would allow them to accumulate their own wealth. In Tarascan society, these guys were not rich. They were as rich as the emperor had favor to give them. They didn't have their own money, but they could have a really nice place to live if they did their job well. So they'd go back and forth and make sure all these goods would be distributed, or not distributed, brought, funneled to the capital. A big thing that made Tarascan society work was labor as tax. Archaeology or anthropology calls it a corvée labor system, where your taxes for being part of the empire and being protected in it is that you work. And a major occupation was warriors. Remember, as I said at the start, the Tarascans were on the edge of the Aztec Empire. In fact, their border was about 50 miles away from the capital. So a major taxation was the training and then employment of warriors, especially along the border, but also to expand their empire year after year. Another big one was miners, especially over in the area where the Tenochtitlan people were. There were miners. Normal farmers would be trained and then sent into the mines to get the metals out. Farmers, construction, porters, all of these things were typical taxes that people would pay, and this was the backbone of how the empire developed. The road systems, the buildings, all of this was done through labor taxation. Another thing that the capital needed was sacrifices. Like the Aztec, they were a bloody people that believed that their gods needed a lot of sacrifices, a lot of hearts pulled out of people to make things go. The Aztecs had a war god named Huitzilopochtli, but for the Tarascans, their god was a fire god named Curi-Cowri. And Curi-Cowri needed daily sacrifices at the temples at Tinsunsan, so a major tribute from all of the forts and things along the border with the Aztecs was to pick up enemies on that border and bring them back to the capital to be sacrificed. Now, on the semi-lighter side of things, what really glued everybody together and made everybody feel like they were one community or one society was their monthly festival cycle. There were tons of parties. In fact, the Spanish priests, both for Aztecs and for these guys, would write that they were upset that people would never work. They always just were preparing for the next party. And that was true in a lot of ways. They had all of these festivals that were ritualized and they were annual. And they were the core of social life. There'd be music and dancing and food. And absolutely everybody looked forward to these festivals and they participated in them. Now, we know that the Tarascans followed the same calendar as everybody in Mesoamerica did, that had 18 months of 20 days each, and then a 5-day period that was kind of weird, and you didn't know what you do, you should stay home. And then you could get back to your 360 days of 18, 20-day months. The Chronicles, unfortunately, only tell us about 13 of them. So we don't, for the Aztecs, we have all 18 in great detail. But the Tarascans, we're missing a couple. We're not quite sure what happened on those. But we have 13 of them. And just like the Aztecs, they were often paired. They'd oftentimes have they'd call it the little festival month and the big festival month. Little festival month would be all about preparing. Like, just for a random example, if it was a big flower festival, everybody would grow the flowers in the first month, and then in the second month they'd bust them out and all the flowers were ready to go. And so some of these months were paired in the preparation time and then the party. Tarascans, again, were, at the core, they were warriors. So they had multiple months that were dedicated to warriors and conquest. This is a picture of some really more Aztec-looking people, but it was a pretty picture. I needed something here. So in this case, sometimes there'd be, the little month would be to train and recruit warriors. And then the big month would be go out there and expand the empire. Now that you're trained and you're in the army, go expand our borders more. And every able-bodied man in the community was expected to participate during these months. You didn't have to be a warrior all year long unless the emperor told you to. But during these months, it didn't matter whether you were a shoemaker or a farmer or a fisherman. It's your month to get your shield and go out and expand the empire or protect us from the Aztecs' encroachment. There was one particular month that was talked about in the Chronicles, that it was the month they called evildoers punished. And they'd take these people that they thought had done wrong, and they'd have these for entertainment gladiatorial matches. And they would do things, this is not necessarily a good picture, you can see it a little here. They'd tie the person's leg, the evildoer would be tied, so he couldn't really get away, and then the warriors would come up and beat him to death. So it was kind of gladiatorial entertainment. But they would kill these evildoers, and then when they were done, they'd carefully cut their skin off, and they'd wear it. And they'd run through the streets wearing their enemy's skin. The Aztecs did the same thing. In fact, they had a whole month dedicated to just wearing your enemy's skin, and they used to walk through the town's streets, and little kids would come out with wooden swords and pretend like they were fighting the enemy, but it was actually somebody wearing somebody's gross skin. It's weird, isn't it? There's a whole god there's a whole god based on flaying people and wearing their skin. That's the darker side of these people. But on the lighter side, these festivals were something everybody looked forward to because there was mass feasting for everyone. Oftentimes the feasting came from the stores of Tinsunsan. Everybody would be invited into the capital, and you know, before you had refrigerators and everything, you can really only hold food so long. So when everybody gives you food, these festivals were actually a way to just eat the food before it spoiled. But it also showed the emperor's generosity, and it got people into the capital. They also always involved some form of human and animal sacrifices, and they almost always involved sending an extra dose of tribute to the king or emperor in Tinsunsan. There was, in fact, one month that was specifically dedicated to everybody needs to send firewood to Tinsunsan. Everybody from all around the kind of deserty area would have to send in firewood because they always had to keep fires burning in their temples. They had this eternal fire that was never supposed to go out. If it did, it was very bad luck. They also had a system of, what do you call them, fire signals. They'd go from mountaintop to mountaintop, so they had little places where you could light a fire, like in, what's that Lord of the Rings movie? Everybody seen that thing where they light the fire and then they know that, you know, it's time to come to the assistance to the other? The Tarascans actually had that sort of system, so they needed a lot of firewood, both for the temple and for defense. Now let's talk about the Kazansi and the royal family. These guys are really they lived a completely different life than the average Tarascan. They were like the picture of European royalty. It was good to be the king. They had everything. Everything was owned by this Kazansi, and everybody else was something else. There was an extended family that was treated differently. There were priests that lived up on that big platform, and there were nobles around the lake that were given special privilege. And oftentimes when they got out to the edge of the empire, instead of, you know, they'd say, well, you know, we could kill everyone in town, or, you know, if the mayor could come out here and talk to us, you know, would you guys like to be part of the Tarascan Empire? We'll treat you specially. You can have a house in Pascoro, and all you got to do is convince everybody to work for us. That's how often it would go. So there'd be sometimes some named nobles in other places. But generally speaking, all those people got exactly what the Kazansi wanted them to have, and nothing more. So there was this massive tribute system that all funneled into Tinsunsan. And it was much more often than the Aztecs. The Aztecs had it like once or twice a year. But the kings in Tinsunsan, they wanted it once every 80 days. So there was almost a constant flow of goods. I mean, as soon as you'd make corn, well, you owed the corn. Of course, you'd have some for yourself as well. Why 80 days seems like an odd thing. Remember, they had 20-day months. So every 4 months, you owed. And there were a lot of things that only the king and the nobles could have. The king would get it, and then he'd give it to nobles if he liked them. One of them was metal objects. In all those markets, nobody but the royalty ever got metal objects. So it was kind of a status symbol. If you saw somebody with a metal necklace like this, you knew they were people of status because lower people aren't allowed to have any metal. Only the royalty and the nobles and the priests were allowed to have it. There were also food products that they could only have. Cacao or chocolate didn't really grow in western Mexico, but they would import it, probably contraband across the Aztec border, and only the nobles would be able to eat the chocolate. Or quetzal feathers. They're these big, beautiful green feathers that come from the jungles of Guatemala and somewhat lower Mexico. And they put these in costuming. And if you saw somebody in quetzal feathers, again, you'd know, well, from afar, you could tell that's somebody of special status. And of course, laborers were a big part of it. There was a huge area of the estates of the king that needed all sorts of people. And every 80 days, they'd have a shift out of guard. Okay, now, you know, this town and this town are going to supply all the people that make the palace work. There were royal estates, and they were in huge areas around the lake. They weren't just at Tinsunsan. They were the best places around the lake that were specifically the king's land. He had big forests. He'd have all of his food never came from some other place. It was grown on his land, and it was brought to him from his land. So he had his own place and his own farmers. They also made all their own cotton, and they made maguey as well. Maguey is an agave plant, and it wasn't, that's where tequila comes from. And they didn't have a distillation process back then, but they could ferment it, and it was this thing called pulque, and it was just as alcoholic. It just was much nastier. But so they had their own maguey plants and his own forest. The king was known to go into these forests in his own hunting parties, a lot like you think of like medieval European kings would go into the forest with their hunting entourage. The Cazonce would do that sort of thing in these big forests that were all around Lake Pasquaro. Unfortunately, all those forests are gone today. Every one of them got chopped down. It was either for agriculture or more often for cattle. But it's one of the tragedies of Michoacan that they've chopped down all their trees. There used to be these beautiful forests, and a lot of them, I guess technically all of them, were the property of the king. Now, he lived upon this giant acropolis. And this is the home of the Cazonce. Every one of the drawings that I can ever find only show this, with the big platform going up and these 5 semicircular interconnected temples. These were actually the temples in the very front. And his palace and all the storerooms were back here. But the Spanish completely destroyed them, and we don't really have any good pictures of them. Or there haven't been excavations. If they're there, they're just in their bases. They got completely ripped down, so we don't really know what they look like, but we know they were there. Now, just to give you a size of what this is, and again, yardstick, Aztecs we know, Tarascans nobody's heard about. This is the Temple Mayor in the heart of Tenochtitlan. This is the biggest giant temple. This is the temple of the Aztecs. Here it is, over here, inserted in the palace at Tinsunsan. Look at how tiny it is compared to this thing. So their structure actually dwarfed the biggest structure that the Aztecs ever made. In fact, it's in total size here, this is 400 meters by 250 meters, which means up on top of it, you could put 30 football fields. That's how big this thing was. So, massive, impressive structure. Now, those 5 temples up on top were called yacatas, and that's where the priests did all their business. They organized all the festival cycles there, and one of them was the place where the eternal fire was kept. I always think it was probably this one that they dug down to the bottom to see if it had any gold in it. That was probably the special one and why it got so destroyed and the other ones were left. But only one of them held the sacred fire. But this was where kind of the religious heart of things happened. And the king lived behind it. He was also the religious leader, though. There were palaces and storehouses back there. All the tribute was kept in those storehouses. The priests lived there. There was the royal palace. And when I was reading through that Chronicle of Michoacan, it told me this interesting thing that back in the storage areas, kind of in between that and the palace, they found this one room that had piles of severed trophy heads. And yeah, the Aztecs chopped off a lot of heads too, but they always kept them as skulls and they put jewelry around them. These were described as desiccated and still having their skin on them like this. And again, that's what the South Americans did. They chopped off heads all the time and they would desiccate them and put them in these things as trophies. I wonder whether, once again, we weren't seeing a little South American flavor coming up in this Mexican place. So, in any event, the Tarascan society goes on up until contact. And at contact, the Cazonce's name was Zuinga. And Zuinga was on the throne at 1520. This is actually a statue. My things are getting all pixelated. I thought it would come out better. This is an actual statue of Zuinga. And he's the one who told the Aztecs, no, we're not bailing you out. That's what you get. But then that very same year, the diseases were sweeping all over Mexico, and he died of smallpox that very same year. So his son has to take over. His son is named Tangashoan, and he's a young new emperor. He's got a different attitude from his father. He's heard from everybody about what happened to the Aztec capital, and he sends his brothers to intercept the Spanish and to make peace with them. And they attempt to do so. That's probably where that brother-in-law, that father-in-law thing came around. But the Spanish say, great, yeah, sure, you're welcoming us in, thank you very much. And they come to Tzintzuntzan, and they completely sack the palace. They rummage through everything. And so say the chronicles, when they went through the storehouses at Tzintzuntzan, they found 20 chests of gold and 20 chests of silver. This is just some crazy picture of gold and silver I came up with. This isn't from there. That's just so you have a picture instead of just me. But so this makes the Spanish crazy. If there's anything they're looking for, it's gold and silver. So now that they know that the Tarascans have it, and indeed the Tarascans did have it in much greater quantity than the Aztecs did. You always hear about all this Aztec gold. The truth is, the actual objects that were of gold in the Aztec capital when they showed up, I've heard they would fit in a shoebox. When Cortez asked for gold, they sent away for it in the mines, and they got it coming. But they really didn't have much of it, and they didn't understand. It wasn't a currency to them. It was like a high-quality clay. So they really didn't understand what they were so whipped up about. But when they saw this, they ransacked everything in the palace. Then they went from village to village to village around the lake, ransacking all the temples, looking for all of this gold. Of course, it was only for the nobles, so it was really only there. They destroyed the other towns for no good reason. But after a while, when they depleted this, they said, well, where are the mines? And then they sent people out to the mines. But they wanted more and more and more. And finally, Tangashoan had enough, and he decided that he was going to resist them, and he put up a rebellion. And in response to that, Cortez sends this guy, Cristobal de Olid, and this guy destroys them. He is a psycho. In fact, later on in his career, Cortez actually chases him down all the way down to Honduras because he's leading this crazy extermination of everyone down there. There's messages saying, he's just killing everybody. He's not even negotiating with anyone. This was the kind of guy he was. Of course, we didn't know that. The Tarascans, unfortunately, were the first to realize what a cruel and twisted conquistador this guy was. But he immediately comes in and takes care of the business. He captures Tangashoan and his family immediately. And after torturing him, finally, on February 14th, 1530, he was dragged by horses, strangled, and burned at the stake. And then they ripped down his temples, and they burnt the church. They burnt his palace. And out of the rubble of the palace, they built the first churches there in Tzintzuntzan. And that, unfortunately, was the end of the Tarascan Empire in that very same year. Without their king, they had nothing. They were always organized through the king, who was a semi-deity. With him publicly executed, it was the end of the Tarascan Empire. But I don't really want to leave my lecture on that note. So I put in this one last final slide to say, you know, the Purépecha people, they still exist. They lived through this. They don't call themselves Tarascan, they call themselves Purépecha, and they're still living all around Lake Pascaro. There's over 200,000 people last census that speak Purépecha. They're still doing a lot of the festivals. This is a picture of one of them. And they're still here. And so despite all of that, and despite 500 years of acculturation and oftentimes outright persecution, they've survived. The Purépecha people that were once the mighty Tarascan Empire live on today. All right, thanks. Well, I had exactly 1 hour, and if you have to leave.